Welcome to the Edifice Complex, the property design and development podcast. Let your hosts Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean keep you up with who is innovating and doing great work, perspective on the adjacent possible, and challenges to the status quo.
Welcome to the Edifice Complex. I'm Robert Bean, your co-host and unofficial mediator, here with my colleague, official agitator, friend, and Yoda of most anything to do with buildings, Mr. Adam Muggleton. Say hello, Sir Yoda.
Hello, Yoda. So this is an interesting one today. We're going to be touching on a lot of issues here and maybe even tippy-toeing into a little bit of politics. So this should be good fun.
That's right. Today, our episode is kind of like a mutual admiration event. Our guest has been a long-time atypical listener who very much fits our ethos of study in adjacent fields. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts with distinction in visual studies, but is not an architect in the traditional sense. She's been fighting for better air quality in schools, but is not an engineer. She holds a level 1 certification with the National Air Filtration Association, but is not an HVAC contractor. But here's the thing. She has a BA with distinction in psychology, which in my book makes her more qualified to be an architect, engineer, and contractor than anybody else. Here to the end of the show is our Edifice Complex band, aka Boss Lady, aka Proud Parent, aka Vocal Community Member, aka Don't Underestimate Me, Amanda Hughes. Welcome to the show.
Well, that intro has me pumped to talk about air quality. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Amanda, you are really the quintessential advocate for those that don't have a voice or struggle to find their mama and papa bear voice in their homes and in the community and the public health care system. We met online and we've done a lot of advocacy work trying to correct a lot of problems. I've watched you take down the most educated, the most narcissistic, the most arrogant people in public education and public health. It's been a real joy being your fan. And I really want to know, we're going to have a lot of things to talk about today, but I do want to know, how did you end up in the middle of a throwdown in a pandemic, helping people keep their chins up? Because you've just done an awesome job for people.
Well, thank you again. That is one of the most flattering affirmations of the last 3 years for me. It really started, it's one of those things where I'm the kind of person who gets into complex situations because I don't think things should be that hard, and then they become very hard and complex. And really, this all started, this cycle of air quality interest for me it started with wildfire smoke, a couple of years ago. And the idea that we could actually be doing more than just staying inside. That was something that was a fairly new concept to me, when we had very bad wildfire smoke in Western Canada a few years ago. And so, learning a bit about filtration and, how beneficial it could be, in-room air cleaners, that kind of spurred me on. And then the realization through, people who are so generous with their skills and their knowledge, like you, Robert, sharing this information about how these very simple solutions could be applied to COVID and respiratory illness in schools and in hospitals. It kind of was one of those things where I started and said, that shouldn't be that hard. We should be able to do it. Right. And so, right. So, like so many other parents, like so many other, people who were looking around saying, what can I do to help other people during the pandemic? I asked a teacher friend if they needed, an air filter, and, the do-it-yourself Corsi Rosenthal box style was really picking up steam in terms of, an accessible solution that could be made quickly and affordably. And so, I offered to make her one, and that turned into a 2-year fight with the school boards because of what has become an irrational fear or bias against clean air in schools.
Which is an absolute bizarre construct when you think about it. Like, who do we want and where do we want good air? And it's students and people in hospitals. Like, it is so bizarre that this has gone on. And yourself and is it Tracy Cassavant in BC?
Yes, in BC, yeah.
Like another warrior, right?
Yeah. It has become so much more than what it started as, right? And that there are basic solutions that have come from experts in the built environment, experts in aerosol science and engineering, and that these solutions were the things that were never really applied to the pandemic because of politics, right? And politics in public health and politics in government. So it's been fascinating to see how, an initial reluctance to do things for cost reasons or, maintenance reasons has morphed into, a kind of wanting to ignore an entire problem of air quality in schools and in other congregate public settings. It's been fascinating.
Just to set the scene a little bit for our international audience. So in North America, I'm in Canada and the US here. Schools are school boards, the governors and the people that run the schools and the senior people in the schools are political bodies in North America. Unlike other parts of the world.
Yeah, so the school board trustees are elected.
Yeah, so there are elections to get certain people in. They are quite political. They are meant to be, the idea is they are that way because they're representative and then they react to local issues. Doesn't turn out that way. It turns out to be a quagmire of politics and tribalism. For me, as a relatively new Canadian, I've only been Canadian since 2011, I find this whole thing strange and ridiculous. But then that's me. But what we're talking about here is schools as a building type, let's be straight, are the most value engineered, corner cut pieces of rubbish ever constructed. There is no corner that is left uncut on a brand new school. You would think we hated children the way we build schools. Then you add in people who have no idea how buildings work, responsible for the maintenance and the budgets. And then load on top of that COVID. Load on top of that politics, load on top of that angry parents. And what you wind up with is what Amanda's been through, is a political backwards and forwards and all in sort of wrestling match. Now,
and if that weren't enough, also now wildfire smoke during the school year, you know, right? That's the additional layer that nobody needed.
No, but what's bizarre about it is how filtration's okay for smoke and gas, but it's not okay for pathogens. Like, how are these people? How do they hold those two thoughts in their brain at the same time? Like, how does that happen? Do they go to bed at night with bottles of Tylenol to try to deal with the headache between trying to connect those two dots?
That's the part that's been really fascinating as, becoming so entrenched in this, because it hasn't made sense to me for the past 2 years why, school boards would firstly disallow air filters. Then secondly, so they wouldn't procure them. That makes sense, right? They don't want to spend the money. I totally get that. But then disallow them. So when they're donated or when a parent council decides to spend discretionary funds, then they are, not allowed. Or then they're put in.
Can we put a point? So what you're saying to me is presumably this is the Calgary School Board area, right? School district.
Right. But this has been an international problem. Right. So this is the thing that's fascinating about it.
So you're saying if someone donates what they need, they don't accept it?
Yeah, there was a case in Calgary specifically where one school was getting their boiler fixed and their HVAC system fixed. So they had no ventilation in the school. And, that's something we can get into as well. The differences of how buildings are designed based on climate which is something your listeners know more about than me. But this school was getting their ventilation system fixed. And this was in 2021. So the parent council said, oh, let's buy some HEPA filters because there's no ventilation in the school at all and kids are getting sick. And so they were allowed for the period where the ventilation system was being fixed. And then as soon as it was fixed, they actually removed them all and said, you have to remove them. And then there was instances of, teachers putting them into their classrooms and then someone reporting it and getting confiscated and removed from their classroom. And it's been so fascinating. And, people who even had prescriptions because the student had a medical condition where they had very severe allergies and their doctor said they need additional filtration in their classroom. It would take months and months to get an approval for that. And then, policies like, well, only the teacher and that student can be in the classroom when the HEPA filter is running. Things that just don't make any sense.
Wow.
So just on that example, who's making that decision? Did they give a rationale when this decision came down? Like, we're doing this because?
So it's the pathway to understanding this was that we had to go, me and other parents who were kind of confused, pretty much all around the world, because I've connected with people in Europe, I've connected with people in the States, and, worked really closely with people across Canada who have been as flummoxed as I have been about this. They always would give the same set of excuses. So, something like a HEPA filter in a classroom is a fire hazard. A HEPA filter in a classroom will interfere with the building's ventilation, the building's built-in ventilation system. A HEPA filter will actually make infections worse because it blows the virus around in the room. It was kind of all of these excuses. Oh, it will be an electrical load risk that will cause the entire school's electrical grid to collapse or something. And, it was these really so through this process, I ended up making a rebuttal matrix of these common concerns that were being given to parents about why HEPA filters could not be used, that were popping up in schools all over North America when parents would say, can we add one of these? And they were all the same. And then we would come up with a response because these are obviously ridiculous things. And then the parents would then go through the matrix and be able to say, oh, they gave me this feedback, therefore I need to say this. And then they might respond with this. And then I will say, finally, this is actually not a fire hazard citation. It was algorithmic in terms of its the responses that made no sense.
Wow. This is so bad. It's funny and then tragic all at the same time, right?
Yes.
Well,
and
it is.
Yeah. And the reflection of that, it really put into a spotlight how, when you talk about, how schools are built with cutting corners and the level of information that parents have had to learn about ventilation and why I've ended up here talking to you. And, things like the things that they used to placate parents and say, well, all of our schools are mechanically ventilated, therefore they're very safe for viruses. And, that was supposed to be, because they could compare to other provinces where not all their schools were mechanically ventilated. But we live in Alberta, which the climate goes up to minus 35. So, forced air furnaces and that kind of heating system is kind of very common here. So most, they have to be mechanically ventilated. And so all the schools are. So it was just fascinating to see the level of energy that went into building these card houses of excuses as opposed to just looking at how to solve the problem.
Yeah. One of the biggest ones that came up, a couple of them was, particularly in BC, but also in Alberta, where the school boards, would make the statement that the schools were designed according to ASHRAE standards.
Yes, and that was such an irritating one because, you have to be, as a layperson, the person who says, well, what standard? Are you talking 62.1, 62.2? Like, and, this is the thing where people get very confused by, what my background is, because they'll send an email to a parent that says, well, a parent has asked, can I get the air quality measured in my child's classroom? And so they will give them maybe, they'll say, okay, we measured the air quality. They'll give them an average CO2 reading for like over the weekend when it's not occupied. And then they'll say, well, 1200 ppm or 1500 ppm is actually very good because it's only 700 ppm above ambient, et cetera, right? And then me, a layperson, gets this email from this parent and has to respond. That's actually from a rescinded appendix of an ASHRAE standard that ASHRAE rescinded this. And so, and it's for bioeffluents. It's not for infectious disease control. And so, that was kind of the back and forth that we ended up having with, licensed professionals who are in charge of these buildings, because it's gotten very ridiculous. Well,
and the big thing there too is that it was like banging our head against a wall, because we were essentially screaming that 62.1 was never designed to deal with pathogens. So saying that the school was designed to 62.1 was meaningless. And furthermore, the standards, and this we're preaching to the choir here, but the standards go through an evolutionary stage. Like, they're always updated. So to say that they were designed to a standard, well, to what year? But it's a moot point anyways, because they weren't designed to deal with the pathogen. That's what 241 is all about. So you're right. We had people, throwing out the ASHRAE standard, not knowing what it meant, how it was to be applied, knowing that was ineffective.
The one that really, I think, got to you was when they said, we talked to ASHRAE and they said our schools are safe.
Yeah, and that just threw us over the top.
That was a trustee who said that to a parent, who said, we talked to ASHRAE and they said the schools were safe. And then, and so through this process, of course, connecting with Robert and other professionals like Dr. William Banfleth, who was the chair of the epidemic task force, we connected with him. And so through this process, we actually, approached the Northern Alberta and Southern Alberta chapters of ASHRAE to write a letter to Alberta schools to kind of give them the Coles Notes of the epidemic task force guidelines for schools. And so they did that. Then another parent approached Dr. Banfleth and got him to write a letter to Alberta schools saying, I affirm that this is correct. Furthermore, HEPA filters in-room air cleaners are part of our guidance, and it's not verboten, right? Yeah. And so, after we even had, ASHRAE members who were licensed in the province do presentations to trustees. And so after all of that, to have someone say, ASHRAE told us it was safe. And then, I wanted to respond, well, I've talked to Dr. Banfleth and he disagreed. like it was wild. It was so wild.
Well, if you recall, Amanda, we ultimately had Bill come on, and then for the Alberta program, we had Matt Oliver do the pre-introduction. And so the program was for Alberta School Board, for designers, operations people, anybody that really wanted to listen. And we actually end up with a huge number of people on, but nobody from the school board. Like, they just wouldn't show up. Yeah. And it was like, are you kidding me? You have some of the world's experts.
I know. It's like, I attended that seminar and it was like, I was like, this is amazing. I learned so much. And so I'm like, why am I this person going to this seminar, the Alberta Engineering Association was holding with the chair of the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force, and then school building owners or school building managers weren't attending. the interesting part of that too is that we connected with vendors as well, vendors that were supplying all of the school boards with their HVAC filters, because that was kind of one of the things of that they said, well, what we'll do is we'll tell the parents and people who are concerned that we upgraded to MERV 13 filters, and then we'll shove them off, and then they won't be worried about it. And so we actually, got in touch with the vendors who supplied them with the filters, and they said, we have been telling them this is going to be a thing for their schools in the future, and they better get on it now. And they actually held a 3-part series seminar for building operators as well, where they went through, the healthy buildings standard from J.G. Allen, and the Harvard, all of the Harvard work, and so I saw some of because I attended those too, because I was talking to BGE, who is the organizer, and went through and at the end on the 3rd session, they did kind of misconceptions about using in-room air cleaners in schools that were, basically debunking all of the things that they had been telling parents. And I saw that there were building managers and, superintendents of facilities from all of the school boards that attended that. And so it was just baffling to me how that, it didn't seem to stick, and that the pervasive, belief that, and the reason I say that it was, because we can speculate as to the reasons why, but then we also filed freedom of information requests to check what was actually going on. And there was, to a certain extent, in the discourse of many school boards, internally and externally to their counterparts in other cities, that they did really believe these things about HEPA cleaners, or HEPA, in-room air cleaners. They did believe the blowing the virus around. They did believe the interfering with the building HVAC. And that's what I found most baffling, was that after all of that information, that these professionals actually still believed that misinformation.
So then this is the thing again, how can you hold 2 opposing thoughts in your brain at the same time and go to sleep at night? So they would be saying things like, don't use the in-room filtration because it blows the virus around. And then in the next breath, they'd say, open the windows and let the cross flow ventilate the space.
Yeah. And then there was the other opposing view of,
can you be that stupid?
And also the idea, this is the one that really got to me, particularly with the instance of when they said they were worried about the prescribed HEPA filter being used around other students, which was that, okay, so if you're saying that you think that the virus blowing around is a concern, then you're acknowledging that there is a hazardous contaminant in the space to be blown around. And so why aren't you mitigating that in some way?
Right.
Because if you think it's hazardous enough to cause issues when it's being blown around, then you're admitting that it's a hazardous contaminant.
And of course, but there's a saying we found ASHRAE and they're okay with it. ASHRAE is certifying their building. I went, if ASHRAE actually thought that was being banned around, they would sue them.
Well, that was one of the things that people were saying, that they consulted with ASHRAE, but ASHRAE is not an engineering company.
Yeah.
It's an association of engineers.
Right.
They don't they're not practicing engineers.
No.
We write.
And, the other ironic part about that too is that then they did actually, through our freedom of information requests, we did find that they did consult with engineers, and the engineers told them to do the exact same thing that the ASHRAE letter said that we had told them to do. And then, so they had paid engineering consultants, to give them a roadmap to improving air quality in schools, and then did not do it. I'm shrugging. I know this is an audio medium, so I'm shrugging right now.
I know why they did not do it. But just before we get to that, how angry did the parents get during the course of all this? How agitated did it get?
I think the thing that really, I would say I think a dejected frustration is really what, because it kept there was, it was kind of this runaround of we would find another, we would find, guidance from the government of Alberta and Alberta Health Services that advise schools to use HEPA air cleaners. Yeah. And we would present that to them and say, well, no, that doesn't work because of XYZ reason. And then we would say, okay, well, this Society of Engineers has said this, and we have gotten these letters written for you. And they said, well, no, that doesn't work because the government says XYZ. And then we'd say, but we gave you the government guidance. And they said, no, we're talking about the federal government. Well, the federal government also says to use HEPA air cleaners, and then there was just no movement. And so ultimately, the thing that I think was really frustrating was that there was still this perpetuation of these falsehoods to parents while their kids were getting sick all the time, and then their families were getting sick all the time. And then nothing changed. And the propensity of evidence for, indicating that you could use this. And even then one school board did invest in HEPAs for every classroom. And still other school boards said, oh, well, we can't do it. It's not allowed and it doesn't do anything. And despite one school board having done it, purchased the HEPA filters, put them in the classroom and saw lower absence rates for the next year and a half.
One of the most frightening things about this whole thing is that these were people that went through the same education system that all of us have gone through, and they just don't get it. They just could not understand what was being said, what they were reading. They were in denial. There was just, what's the term? Cognitive dissonance? En masse. It was so bizarre. Yeah. I made it a mission of mine to do a low cost, nobody was harmed in these research projects. So I would do, something that anybody could do in their home to show about airborne distribution of particles. From everything from taking videotapes of the leaves falling off the trees and the pollen off the plants to, steam coming out of the steam kettle and then walking by and seeing how it gets displaced. And, it was it's all around us. Mother Nature is the perfect blackboard for describing what happens with particles in spaces. And these people, it was and these are degreed people.
Well, I think the fascinating thing about it was that the one email that I think, looking through all those FOIs that really got me was when I found one from November 2020 where it was a listserv of all of the occupational health and safety people for all the school boards saying, ASHRAE's released these new guidelines. I guess they're moving the goalpost again, now saying that, COVID is airborne and we need to treat it like an airborne contaminant. I guess they're just trying to make money on filters or something, right? It was so they had read it, and these were the people who were responsible for occupational health and safety in the buildings. And, it was almost like this air of that ASHRAE and had come up with these guidelines to inconvenience them in some way. Oh my gosh, another thing to make our job harder during this pandemic. And that was the overall trend where I really felt that the people who are operating buildings, they seem to have very little connection to the idea of the occupants of those buildings. And especially in this case, that the occupants of these buildings are children. And so the way that in which they talked about their work and assessing all of these things was about, it really sounded as if these buildings never had any people in them. They were just buildings, that just existed, and that was their job.
Wow. The limited experience I've had with school boards is they're very imperial. So do you think they just saw this as a peasants' revolt to be put down at all the parents coming at them?
It was very fascinating because we tried the same kind of approach for the two largest school boards in Alberta. So there's the Calgary Board of Education and the Edmonton Public School District. And so the approach that we had was that, we had these letters from the ASHRAE chapters, a letter from Dr. Bunfleth. We had an ASHRAE member engineer present to the trustees. We had evidence. We had all the guidance from the government of Alberta and Alberta Health Services, and we presented all this to them, and even started adding the things about air quality impacting educational outcomes, because there's a lot of research on that as well. It was kind of like, it ended up being a sliding doors moment, right, where the trustees of the Edmonton School Board seemed to see the value in it and seemed to say, and then one of the trustees was quoted later saying, well, we might get another wildfire smoke season, and so that would be good for that too, right? It's, I think it's a good investment. And so they invested $6 million in that. The other school board just doubled down and said that this was not something that was needed, that they had done, all their due diligence, and that was fine. And, the behind the scenes part of that, in looking at their correspondence, was that all the school boards were preparing for another fall and saying, well, what are we going to do about those parents who keep hassling us about the air filters? Like, what are we going to tell them this year? And the Edmonton School Board said, well, we bought the HEPA filters, so that's not really a problem for us anymore. And then the other school board said, well, okay, well, what are we going to do then? Because we still have that problem, right? And so, and that's the part that goes into it, of the massive amount of energy spent on finding ways to tell parents that they don't need these things. And, based on like very flawed assumptions, that they have based a lot of their resistance to HEPA filters on, that they used, to spec out for a whole school board, how many would we need? How much would it cost? What are the risks? They picked a model that has a horsepower motor and it uses, I think, it was like the most high powered HEPA filter that, right. I didn't even know that a unit existed like that. And then they said, well, it's going to cost $15 million to upgrade the electrical systems in the elementary schools because they can't handle this. So of course we can't do it, because it's like $6 million for the HEPA filters and also $15 million to upgrade the electrical systems. And that was an inherently flawed calculation to base so much of this on. And so it's become more, finding new ways to justify not doing it than ever considering, oh, maybe we should just do it, or maybe there's a good reason to.
So you know what happened there, Amanda, right? Somebody on the school board's sister was married to a guy that knew somebody that was in the sales business, and he went online and searched for powerful HEPA filters, and then that came back to you, and then that became,
that was the gospel. Yeah. And I think it was a lot of, telephone, right? A lot of, one guy said off the top of his head, it was XYZ that, would be the specs for a unit, or, the specs for this. And then that became the official number, or the official, information that was used to make these policy decisions. And, it was, things that were presented, like HEPA filters don't actually capture the size of particles that viruses are transmitted in. And I was like, that's ridiculous, right? And so it was like, but then it became gospel. HEPA filters don't capture the size of particles that viruses are transmitted in. And there was no amount of, once that was set in stone, there was no amount of evidence that seemed to deter that. And that's been like a global thing. And it's been fascinating.
Where are the journalists here?
So we had a lot of coverage on it, right? Like we had national coverage where, parents were fighting for this, and it was getting really ridiculous. We were on CBC's The National. talking about HEPA filters, especially in the winter of 2021, early 2022. And then, we kept going. There was an investigative report into like everything we had done where parents and students were bringing CO2 monitors covertly into classrooms because they just didn't think that the ventilation was very good, and they were proven right. And, then the deterring factor was, the school board saying, well, we don't think that you used an appropriate CO2 monitor to measure that. And then we look at the reports, and the school board is using CO2 monitors that are, 0 to 350 ppm, right? And that they're saying that's accurate when we know that atmospheric CO2 is much higher now. And so it was that level of stuff. And the really frustrating thing for me was that we did a lot of these media cycles, especially when we got these really big waves of respiratory illness where, at our local children's hospital, they had to put a heated trailer in front of the hospital because there were so many sick kids that they couldn't even fit them in the hospital waiting room. And that was like a huge crisis. And still that didn't move the needle. We had the Alberta Medical Association write a letter to the province and the school board saying, you need to add these things. You need to put more measures in, and nothing. And then the cake, the cherry on top was that we had wildfire smoke at the end of the school year. And there were kids who could see smoke in the hallways, and, kids were like suffering from smoke inhalation and like throwing up in school, and still they wouldn't put HEPA filters in the classrooms.
Where is the provincial health minister here? How has he not intervened? There's an A/B test going on here, right? There's the Edmonton School Board. We know, so look, let's face it, kids don't vote, which is why they don't count, right? But Edmonton spends $6 million and they start an A/B test at that point, right? Edmonton this, Calgary that. And if I'm the health minister, I'm sitting there every question time thinking, someone's going to ask me an awkward question here, right? If I'm the health minister, I'm intervening. I'm saying, Calgary, fix this, or I'm going to fix it for you. How's that happen?
Maybe you remember this, but in the very beginning of the pandemic, like within the first 6 months, Maclean magazine had 2 lawyers from Montreal or Quebec who specialized in health care systems in Canada. And they wrote an article about who has authority in Canada when it comes to health. And all of the ministers have the power to override any political voice in their province. They have the power, but every one of them never used it.
Cowards, man. Absolute cowards.
So you mean the medical officers, you mean? The medical officers of health, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was, and so this was like, getting more into the politics side. And, the legal part of this was that there was a legal challenge to, the removal of mask mandates in schools in Alberta. And, because the legal challenge was that the claimants kind of said that the government had made decisions that were contrary to the advice of the chief medical officer of health. And so through that process, there were disclosures of the information that the chief medical officer of health gave to the cabinet to make these decisions. And, what they found was, masks reduced outbreaks by, 3 times compared to schools that didn't have masks. And the most compelling thing for me was that schools seed outbreaks of illness into communities. And so it's not that whatever people are getting sick and then they bring it to school. It's that a sick person is at school, makes all of the kids sick, and then they go out back to their families and spread the illness everywhere.
It's a germ machine.
And
right?
Yeah. And so the interesting thing was that, this was not compelling in terms of, addressing this in schools. And I think that this is, again, a global phenomenon that they just decided that we were going to decide that this level of illness was okay. And that there was a justification of not needing these tools because it's no big deal now, so we don't need them. And so, they, I think, succeeded in some ways because people are not concerned about illness in schools in the same way that they were, right? Despite the fact that we had that trailer in front of our children's hospital.
But remember, kids don't vote. So,
right.
Do you think that Edmonton spends $6 million, change it, turn it around, right? How can you ignore that, one? But two, is it because Calgary School Board didn't have $6 million? Is it as simple as that?
It could be. I mean, I think the interesting part was that Edmonton had, when they use their reserve funds for something like this, they do have to ask the Minister of Education if they can use these funds. And so, Edmonton had, allocate these funds, asked the minister, did the purchase in January of 2022. And then you find out that the Calgary School Board hadn't even asked the minister to use any funds for this. Never looked at allocating.
Say no, right? It'd be political suicide. Can we have some filters to save the kids? No. Who's saying that? Nobody.
Well, the fascinating thing from a political side was that I think the Edmonton School Board got a little bit in the bad graces of the government because they did something different than everybody else.
Oh, so they stuck out like a tall poppy.
Yeah, and that it kind of indicated, and I think this has been the kind of counterpoint that there could have been more that was done. And so if everybody was doing the same level of minimum, that you could say, well, we couldn't have done anything more.
Yeah,
we couldn't, but whereas this was an indication that there were some other things that we could have tried. And then to see, and I think people do not realize that Edmonton's school board, and I mean, I can't confirm that this was like because of the air filters, but they've consistently had a, 0.5% to full percent lower absence rate for students than Calgary has since they put the air filters in. And I think that's significant when you're talking about, 3.5% of students are away versus 5%, like, 5% of students are away for the whole year. And I mean, the pre-pandemic level of absence rate in Alberta was like, 2.5% of students were probably away at a time. And now, in some schools, it's 20% at a time.
8%.
Yeah, there are many schools in Calgary where, especially during one of those respiratory illness surges, there are 20 to 25% of students away sick. And
that's amazing.
Yeah. And so when you talk about learning loss, when you talk about the outcomes of, trying to get kids back on track through all of this turmoil, it really, it wasn't the like quote unquote restrictions that, it really disrupted things, but kids have missed so much school since there's been nothing done. And I have most of the kids I know, they've missed probably, 40%, 35% of school days because of sickness.
And that would affect the rest of their lives.
In defense of the teachers too, so I have a lot of teacher friends, and they, one of the comments that they made at several of these surges was that with 20% of the students away, so just picture this, Adam's like, you've got 20% of your kids are away, so you're down to 80% of the class, and then those 20% heal, they come back, but then there's another 20% that's sick, and so then they leave. So you have this constant rotation of students, and it becomes incredibly disruptive for the teacher. Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And then to make matters worse, we had RSV and influenza A and COVID. So you could come back and then you might get infected with the other thing that's floating around. And so, it was kind of like, I think that a lot of people thought that, us continuing to talk about better air quality to mitigate respiratory illness in schools was like, oh, these hypochondriac parents won't stop. Like, what is their deal? But it was pretty much, I think one of my friends who has 4 kids who, I don't even know how much school they missed, but she said they didn't even finish the school year. Like, they just were sick for the last 2 weeks after having been sick every 2 weeks. And she said, this broke me. And so, like, how are these kids learning? It was more of an endurance race than it was actually education, and like the amount of work that parents missed was just astronomical. Like, I don't know anybody who worked like a full month, in November, December, because their kids were always sick.
Yeah. And so when you think about relative the cost of masks and HEPA filters, the final tally in the financial statements of society was we paid a huge penalty because somebody thought HEPAs don't do anything in filtering.
And the level of subs too, right? Because they had probably, at one point during last surge, they had probably 500, 600 unfilled staff positions. So there were just like, you came to school and like you didn't have a teacher because there weren't enough subs. And subs cost the school board more than, the salary teachers. So you're paying like several $100s to cover that sub, right? So we looked at it and we're like, how many subs did they pay for that would have paid for those HEPA filters and filter replacements, like for like several years, right? It's really baffling.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment.
Are you struggling with paperwork, spreadsheet overload, and project management? Then Blue Rhythm is the solution to help you. Streamline your commissioning and project management process. Go paperless. Increase efficiency and save money. Blue Rhythm is commissioning and project management software by practitioners for practitioners, adapting to your workflows and processes, and doing things your way. Blue Rhythm provides painless and fast onboarding by bringing your existing workflows, forms, checklists, and issues logs into Blue Rhythm for you. You can use their pre-built templates to customize your commissioning workflows. And Blue Rhythm can fully handle the transition from your current software platform. Blue Rhythm is secure, scalable, and reliable, backed by amazing support, and accessible 24/7 on any Windows, iOS, or Android device. Why are you still using paper and hard-to-control spreadsheets? Start your free Blue Rhythm account today at bluerhythm.com.
And now, back to the show.
What we need here, though, so all this has happened. There's takeaways and lessons to be learned here, right? So, in the ideal world, there would be this introspection and analysis. People would say, we've got to upgrade the schools. We've got to get to a standard. Let's do it. Let's upgrade the main ventilation systems, incorporate HEPAs or whatever, even MERV at a certain level, right? And just do better. Yeah, this is Adam's fantasy world, by the way. I know I don't live in this world. I just want to be in this world. But do you think anything will change? Do you think there will be a redo or a relook at the whole ventilation system thing there?
I think, the thing that I kind of wish for through all this and still wonder if there's a pathway to is just a level of acceptance and honesty that this is a problem that is facing, all buildings in society. Like, like when we, as your most of your listeners, again, know more than me about the built environment, impacts us, and whether it is built well, whether it is built thoughtfully, and also the transparency of that approach, right? And the thing that I always just wished for was, after I had seen what people thought, what people knew who were in charge of all these things, and then getting a report that they paid for that told them to do all of these things. It was. And even the conversations I had with the contractors and the suppliers of these school boards, they said, just tell people the truth about where the buildings are at and tell them where you're going from here and tell them what the plan is. And so, the level of deferred maintenance of school buildings, puts this in an even greater hazard zone, of course, right? But, there's capital planning that looks at, upgrades to things that we accept schools need to be upgraded for. Like, we understand that asbestos mitigation is something that schools need to do, and they put it in a capital plan. And so to go through this whole process and for them to say, everything's fine, and then you find out they're, maybe they're stuffing MERV 13 filters in a univent system that can't handle that, right? Like that was stuff that we found out, right? And
it's not
it was
just
because
changing filters.
Yeah. And so it was like if there was this, if the level of duplicity was gone, they could just say, we're targeting these schools, then we're going to do these schools. We're going to look at this stage planning. We understand that this is an ongoing risk. And it's just become farcical, like, especially with the added wildfire smoke layer of, where then they send messages to parents saying, well, we're closing all the external ventilation, for the fresh air intake because of the wildfire smoke. So then you have all the kids hotboxing, viruses inside.
Recycling that CO2 everywhere.
And that there are schools where they said that they put in MERV 13 filters, where they didn't put in MERV 13 filters, but they can't admit that they didn't put them in those. So it's like, then you have indoor air recirculating through maybe MERV 8 filters, or, and then they said, well, we still can't use HEPA filters, even when they have closed their outdoor intake, their fresh air intakes, right?
Wow.
And so it's all of these compounding things where you see that it's like, again, a house of cards of all of these things to avoid this one solution that actually would solve several of their problems. And that's the thing it's like, well, you're so much effort, so much built up, so many lies, and so many, like almost, narratives that they have to uphold to not solve the initial problem that they have in the first place, that they know the answer to.
It's a house of lies backed up by pride, right?
Yeah.
Pride is a huge thing, right? Because then it started becoming this like credentialism thing too, where they would respond to parents and say, well, we have class 5 power engineers operating all of the schools, so you don't need to worry. And then of course it was like, well, class 5 power engineer is like, it's like it's a 1 year like certification course. It's lower than class 4. It's lower than class 3. And so, it was like another thing to get people off the path. And then, saying this to parents who are licensed professional engineers, or like, like who are scientists, right? And there was no, it was just so anti-collaboration. And then it became punitive when they started, banning these parents from school grounds for asking about what filtration they had in their HVAC system, or threatening to call the police on parents for asking, what the CO2. Yeah, that happened.
Oh,
so like, there was a parent coming to pick up his kid, and then he sees the caretaker and says, oh, like, did you guys get any new like filters for your school recently? Like, did they upgrade the filters? And then the administration was called, and, the principal escorted him off the school grounds and said, we will call the police if you talk to our staff again without approval. Like, it boggles my mind how ridiculous it's gotten.
So I would have gone straight back and said, call the police right now. I'm going back in there.
Like, what are you going to say? Like, yes, I did in fact ask him what MERV level, like what crime is that? I don't understand.
Do you imagine being in jail? You're in jail with your cellmate. You said, what are you in for, mate? Yeah, took me to the janitor at school.
Yeah. I found out they, hadn't sealed their filters, and so that's kind of the level of where I don't understand, it goes beyond the cost, it goes beyond the logistics. It becomes like a vendetta against.
This is politics and pride, and I must make the peasants comply. That's all that's going on.
And the peasants in this case are children.
And the peasants are the children and their parents. This is a peasants' revolt, and you will comply. That's all it's coming down to, right? Right or wrong is now out the window. It's about compliance. Who wins the compliance game? Well, holy goodness, I feel so pretty angry right now. I want to go and punch someone. Jesus, this is so bad.
And so people ask me, like, why are you still going on about air filters in classrooms? And then when I kind of unravel all of this all of these things, which started again with, I just wanted to make a DIY filter for my friend's classroom where she had 42 kids, and they were all like, really vulnerable newcomer families who had like a lot of siblings at home. And she said, like, I just don't want, if one of the parents gets sick, or like if both of the parents get sick,
Right.
then my student will be responsible for taking care of their siblings. And then, this was the impact that these policies were having on kids. And, kids taking this level of emotional responsibility when one of their classmates would get sick and say, oh, I can't believe we got our friend sick, and now he's like really sick. And it's like, that was the thing where I said, the adults who are, in charge of this, who are professionally bound by ethics and their training to be dealing with this, have foisted the responsibility onto children. And that's the part that
children don't vote and they don't have money, which means they have zero value in anything.
Right. But I guess I was just like, the buildings that you operate have children in them.
No one cares.
And that was, and so, but I think that was the part that when we saw that even when everyone decided not to care, it still made things pretty hellish for everyone, regardless of whether you cared or not. And so then that trailer was outside the hospital. People could not make it through a week without one of their kids getting sick. And like the economic impact of that, I can't even fathom that.
It's also the ripple effect of all this going down through people's lives, their education, the consequential effects. It's this whole thing will echo for a long time. But what we need here is a coterie of yummy mummies and parents with too much time on their hands start, super gluing themselves to principals or principals' desks. Something's got to go on here, right? Where's the protest group here?
Well, we've done it. The challenging part about this is that the same parents who are, reasonably concerned about this and, see the risks ongoing are also some of the most medically vulnerable people. And they, they're fighting for their lives, the lives of their medically vulnerable children. And, it's been the interesting thing is to look through, who is responsible and how do you hold them responsible? And, looking at people's professional obligations and, when, as you say, like, as you're saying to your listeners who are not in North America, these people are elected. And so, in theory, they're supposed to be beholden to their constituents, which has been very fascinating when you see that some of them don't even have voicemails that you can leave a message.
But
point, you hit
there's a fundamental flaw that we have in our society, and it's something that I've been talking about for a long, long time, and that is that minimums become maximum. And when the people that are in charge of minimums are faced with normal stuff that, where the minimums serve the function, everybody's happy, everything's okay. But a pandemic is not a normal thing. It's a life and death. And we have people who invoke, manage minimum requirements in a life-death situation, and they are the wrong people. And that is a fundamental flaw that we have. And until we grasp that and then remove responsibility from these people, because I don't think anybody actually wanted the responsibility.
And they want to say I'm on the school board.
They don't have the skills. They don't have the emotional, intellectual. It's a triage. It's very much a military exercise. I'm not saying we need to apply military mentality to it, but this is a life and death situation. And people who know how to tie their shoes are not the same people that operate on brains. Like, it's not the same level, right? When I think of people like in Alberta, when we've had some amazing, and BC and other parts of Canada, amazing physicians that have stood up and have really, taken a hit, not only from their own peers, but political systems, political people, their own communities, But they've stood up and they said, listen, this requires a higher level of knowledge. This requires a higher level of operation. And we have people in charge that they just don't have it.
Well, this is the Peter principle meets the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So the Peter principle is you get promoted to your basic level of incompetence. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is you think you're awesome. And guess what? You're absolutely not. You put them things together. It's a scoreboard.
Well, it's been fascinating because, I think there's been some real heroes in terms of people in the school boards where they did take action, who they actually were being pressured by the government and by other parents to not do that, right? And so it's kind of that thing where I do understand the difficult position that a lot of people are in. And I was a board member of a post-secondary institution in Alberta, and so those are not elected positions, they're appointed positions. But a lot of the idea of the fiduciary responsibility that you have to an institution is the same. Yeah. And, that was the part that I never understood, was that, yes, we have board insurance. Yes, organizations manage liability for board members. But I kept saying to people, when I was on a post-secondary board, I thought a lot about, if someone's going to sue this school, my name's going to be on the lawsuit, because I am a board member and I hold fiduciary responsibility. And, I think that was not something that people really grasped. And, the implications on insurance, for example, that they had talked to their, several school boards had talked to their insurers and said, it was especially around the do-it-yourself, homemade filters, where they said, well, we'll talk to the insurers and they'll say, obviously, this is a fire hazard, we can't do it, and that'll be our out, right? And then they would talk to their insurers and the insurers would say, yeah, we've looked into this and it seems like a good solution and it would mitigate this. And, you have to do it with the other things that you're obviously still doing, right? And, with ventilation system and masking. But that, I think this is a good way to manage your risk in that way. And then they didn't do that, and then they took all the other things away. And so I don't really understand how that ends up playing out in terms of liability and risk management. And so it doesn't make any sense to me why you would get into a leadership role and take on that level of personal risk as a board member, and not make sure that you're not going to be on the hook for something, because that's the other thing that these school boards are they a lot of it is like, well, the government says this, the government says that, but the school boards are not part of the government. They're a separate institution that has their own fiduciary responsibility to the operations of that institution. And so, it's and I don't know if I'm the kind of person who just always took that responsibility very seriously, but it is a responsibility, and there's a reason why they have these governing structures.
As much as I hate lawsuits, what you need here is a entrepreneurial lawyer like Better Call Saul, who does a class action, gets all the parents together and goes to the school board and the Minister of Health and says, right, we're going to go through this now. We're going to do this AB class action. This is what Edmonton did, is what you guys did. These kids have had their schools disrupted and need compensation. We're going for it. That would be interesting. Just a discovery would be. Yeah.
And that's been very interesting too, where I think the emphasis again is on, when they started telling the kids who were bringing in the CO2 monitors that the CO2 monitors were banned and they would get in trouble if they had them at school. It was, it's kind of like, well, are you looking for plausible deniability? Because, if someone has a CO2 monitor and can prove the ventilation was exceedingly bad in a space, that's evidence towards,
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And so it's like the focus on this whole built house of cards of building up the reasons not to do something, when at a certain point, it seems like it would have just been easier to say, well, we actually got the HEPA filters and then now the parents aren't mad at us, so bye.
Yeah. we can all probably think about times in our lives and our listeners and those that, friends and family and everybody else in the dialogue here, is that when you look at good leadership, good leadership deals with realities. They never sugarcoat it. They just say, this is the way it is. And we can solve it these ways. They don't deny. They don't try to hide. They don't try to run. They will do the things that are necessary. They don't, and I can't remember who they were talking about, but it was, again, Adam, you and I have talked about this in business leadership, is that we are always prepared as leaders to do the things that we ask our people to do on our behalf.
Absolutely.
Right? And that says a lot. If you got people that rise up to the top and they're always directing people to do this, do that, but they would never do it themselves, that's not leadership. That's management. And there's a big difference between leadership and management. Yeah. And we've had no leadership. We've had a lot of managers, a lot of people managing, but nobody leading.
Well, and to your point, there was one parent who went to a trustee meeting at one point, and she noticed that the side door was propped open, and, there weren't very many people in there. And she took out her Aeronet and it said, 5:30 ppm. And so, it was very fascinating. And, when the trustees were elected, I had talked to one of the candidates, and she said, I understand COVID is airborne. I understand we need these air filters. If I'm elected, this is going to be one of the things I work on. She was elected. She emails me 1 week after the election and says, can you build me a Corsi Rosenthal box? And I did. And I went to her house and I dropped it off and gave it to her husband. And he said, wow, she's so excited about this. This is going to be really important. And then nothing happened. And so I'm like, she ended up putting that in her office while she knew that this fight was ongoing, and had, people presenting to her at the board meetings about the need for this for schools. Right. And so it was this, to know that the ventilation in their meetings was really good, and that they had a Corsi Rosenthal box that I had built them. And yet all of this fight continued was really disheartening. And it was kind of like, there's no, I was like, it's really hard to think that people are operating in good faith and it's disappointing when it comes to the safety of kids at the largest school board in Western Canada.
Yeah,
I think she fell into line. But I mean, I did a little bit of work when I had a business in Toronto. We did a little bit of work with the school boards, and I had to stop doing it because there is no money. They will sit there and say, I want this, that, and the other. And you go, okay, no, that's about this much money. Oh, no, we got half of that. And then they mean it. Do you know what I mean? And then, so they have a wish list. They ask for the moon. They don't get it. There's just no money. There is no money at all. We need to shut down the old schools, repurpose old office buildings into schools, and have the army run them, period. Yeah, solved it. Mic drop, done.
And so that was the point where when they were going to get donations, there's probably, we had even pitched because they're, parent councils have, a lot of money. A lot of parent councils are like, we have $45,000 that we have to spend by the end of the year, and we have no ideas about what to do. And so a lot of parent councils pitched buying HEPA filters, and we even had, to address equity concerns, they said, we'll partner with another sister school, and then we can buy HEPA filters for that school too. And so 2 schools would have HEPA filters in their classrooms, and we'd be meeting a need for a school that couldn't afford it. Right. And they said no. And so, that's, and it was this also, again, this kind of really twisted way of approaching equality and equity, where they said that was another excuse, where it's like, we can't have these filters in one school if we don't have them in all the schools. And when they knew that there were some schools that the ventilation system would not take MERV 13 filters, especially these univent systems. So those would have been really easy schools to target with HEPA filters. And so they didn't have to buy them for the whole school board, for example. And so there were so many different options of ways to raise money to ensure that, it wasn't just one rich school that was getting this extra protection because this is the public school system. And then it was just no, like all the way across.
Yeah.
Right. So there's some. Go.
Adam, we're getting to the end of our. Yeah. We don't want to take up all of Amanda's time, but I got to tell you what, we could talk for hours with you. One of the things that we usually do, we didn't because we jumped right into the subject matter, is we like our listeners to hear how people got to where they were, and you didn't get an opportunity to do that. So I would like to give you that opportunity to share, because here you are, you're talking to the listeners of the Edifice complex, and we have listeners all over the world, and people get a chance to talk about like how they got to be where they are. You're very unique in that you're not an architect, you're not an engineer, you're not a contractor, but you're as powerful as any one of them. And I think people need to understand that you, like a lot of other people in society, you have a voice. You just have to use it. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. I want people to hear how, like, your ethos, like how your soul operates. And then Adam, like, we're getting a little bit of a long time, but at some point, maybe we'll have you back on another show. I want to talk about fatigue.
The existential fatigue of living amongst all of these problems. Yeah. I mean, my work has been so varied over my life and my interests. And I mean, I think a lot of it is to do with just, that there's always something to be learned. And I always approach people with the idea that they have something really important that I need to learn from them. And so I think that's been the way that I've been able to pick up so many different things, is that, like, people like you are so generous with your knowledge and the things that you've spent your whole life learning. And so I kind of look at every interaction with new people as that opportunity to say, okay, so what do you know? And how much of that can I learn from you in the amount of time that you are going to give me to learn? And so, I think it started when I was starting to do my psychology degree in university. And then, I had this idea that, I was like, maybe I want to do an art degree. And so, my partner, who then became my husband, he taught me how to draw so I could get into art school. And because I said, you've been drawing your whole life. This was like what you did as a kid. Can you teach me how to draw so I can get into art school? Because I really like photography. And so then that's what I did, got into art school. And then, that put me on a path of like all of this visual art and that creativity. And then, working at a nonprofit art gallery after graduation really geared me into more of that advocacy side, right? Because I saw the extreme inequity of how the arts was funded versus, other programs, and just the weird disdain that people had for public art. And despite the fact that it enriches so much of our lives. And, through all of those things, I learned things from other people and ended up, advocacy had always been part of that, and disability advocacy because of my, my lived experience and my family. And then I ended up working as a patient advocate. And, I learned so much from people and from the experiences of people through the medical system, that I said, well, maybe I can help people navigate that. And, learning how to communicate in many different ways through my past, school experiences. And that really came into play there. And then it kind of then led me to the pandemic, where, we're all at home and we're trying to figure out, how do we help others when we are so far apart from each other? And
there's a huge lesson here for our listeners, particularly for kids that are in school, because that's, who we like, a big part of our audience is kids that are in colleges and universities trying to figure out where they want to be. Adam and I have personalities of number 20 grit sandpaper, where you're more you're the fine polishing. Now, I don't know if that's because you didn't go into the engineering construction business per se, and that you were spared the trauma that we both went through. But I think one of the big lessons that I'm getting out of your story here is that there is a way to influence those around you when you're prepared to learn about their lives and what they've got to offer. And by doing that, you've like built this matrix, this basket weave of knowledge, and you basically hand it over and say, okay, here's what I've learned. Tell me what you've learned, and we'll build this together. And that's pretty powerful.
And I mean, to be fair, like I have to be like, I'm not a completely altruistic, person full of humility, because there's a part of it where, I look at, when I've been so frustrated through this process and through learning so much about, people not doing their jobs properly. And, the idea that we would ask people to be humble, when they're approaching things, and to be able to admit when they're wrong and to change their minds. For me, I said, the only way I can ask people to do that in good faith is if I'm able to do that. Right. So, I mean, that's been kind of my process. But I mean, if I know that people are wrong because I've learned from the best, then they are going to hear about it. And I think that that's the part where, I want, if I'm gonna tell someone they're wrong, I want to make sure that I'm right. And the best way to do that is to learn from the people who know and the people who are the best at what they do. And it comes, I just have that gratitude, because that's a gift to be able to learn from so many people. And that's the gift of this whole last couple of years for me, is to be able to talk to Bill Bondbleth and be able to talk to Shelley Miller. Like, so many of the guests on your podcast are people that I've been able to talk to one-on-one and ask like random questions about building systems. And like, I had no idea prior to 2020 that I would be, have that level of, like Dr. Kim Prather, to be able to talk to the experts, the top experts in their fields, about things that I am passionate about, and that they are willing to tell me these things, and then I can tell other people these things. That's amazing. And so that's the process of being able to do that. And that when you see every person as, an opportunity to learn, then you are open to all of those things and those possibilities and that information.
Yeah. And I think, and one of the key points there is that you are a master at respecting their knowledge, but also their time. And people see that you share that information. That's a lot different than someone who's, it's self-serving. This is about me. This is not about anything other than me. For you, that is like nowhere near your character or traits. It's about gathering information and sharing. And I think that's what makes it's easy for people like, Dr. Prather and Bonfliffs and the Millers of the world to say, yeah, like Amanda will take what we have and she'll like disperse it to millions of people.
Well, I tell you, I grew up, my one of my parents is a doctor. And so I grew up, Christmas dinner, then, he gets a phone call being like, you have to go in and do this thing. Or it was always like, oh, well, can your dad see this person? And, and it was always like a very transactional kind of thing, because a lot of times that's how people interact with each other. Right. And, we have a society where we feel that scarcity. And so if oftentimes we see someone, we want to jump on that opportunity, or we need something from them. Right. And so, for me, it was always I wonder how their families feel, anyone who I'm talking to, how does their family feel if I'm taking up their time when they want to be with them, or, and so it was kind of more, oh, wow, you gave me this gift of this information, as opposed to, wanting to take it from people. Cause I remember that it was tough, when, being pulled in all these different directions. And so I think that that's been the thing where, and that you don't know when, if you offer that information or that, outreach to somebody, when that's going to come back to help you in some way. So it sounds I think a lot of it, it sounds so idealistic and but at the same time, it's it's really helped the way that this has all gone for the past couple of years. Like it's been such a gift to meet so many people and to learn so much.
Yeah. So there's the lesson for our listeners.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
So just
Thanks for
quickly, my
sharing
final
that.
question quick is, what's the next step? What's next?
Well, it's, this is the challenge, right? Because it's funny because I think we're at a point that I never thought that we would get to, where not only do you have to sell the solutions or really convince people that there are solutions for problems, you have to now convince people that problems are worth tackling. And that's been the really scary thing, right? Because when the wildfire smoke has been really bad here, you see people running out, you see people jogging, and it's like hazardous air. And, people have kind of completely understandably resigned themselves to a lot of illness. And, just there's a lot of things that draw on people, the level of social conditions in the world is very challenging. And so, I can see why people give up. And so I think that that's part of, the process, is that saying convincing people that they deserve better in the spaces that they share with others. And that, that whole idea of how we relate to others and how others relate to us. And then, saying I have the solution, but also here's why the problem that we're trying to solve actually would make your life better if we solved this problem. And so that's kind of where we're at now. It's saying you don't have to feel super terrible after a big wildfire smoke bout, if you take these steps. And we don't have to do forever illness that cripples hospitals, if because there are these things that we can do. And part of it is living this ethos that I have of where my life is pretty good, and my life is pretty good because I try to not get sick, I try to not get other people sick, I try to care about things and help other people do that. And so it's not to be aspirational or something, but it's to say hey, we could actually do things a lot better. And I think that that's a huge part of the challenge with, the ongoing struggles that we all face as a society, not to get too grandiose, but to say, we don't have to accept what we're doing if this is not working for a lot of people, that we could do a lot better. And there's actually a lot of simple things we could do that I've learned from these experts.
I like that. That's a good takeaway to finish on. It is worth convincing people that problems are worth tackling.
That's a great
sentiment to wrap up on, actually. Yeah, well done. So keep up the fight.
and keep up your work too, because I am, as you said at the beginning, I'm an avid listener, and I learned so much about the built environment and what goes into it, because that's important, because we spend so much of our time inside.
Right, absolutely right. Yeah. So thank you for listening, and thank you for coming on. It's been really interesting. I feel my blood is up a lot actually after hearing the what's going on here. It drives me crazy.
That's the thing. That's what I want. I want people to leave saying we should care about this, as opposed to this woman is obsessed with HEPA cleaners. What's going on?
Go down in history as a HEPA filter woman.
That wouldn't be the worst thing, ultimately.
Well, and again, it goes back to attitude. Attitude. It's you can have two families with children, and during this pandemic, some families chose to make this a learning adventure, and that we will survive and we'll get through this and it'll be okay. And then other families chose to, you're restricting our kids, you're wrecking their lives, and it was just everybody has the same choice, and it's just your attitude. And you've got an infectious attitude, and the people around you are infectious, and it's. That's
a poor choice of word, mate. Infectious.
That was deliberate.
Well, I think I think when we all kind of understand that we're kind of on the same boat. So if people are poking holes in our boats, then we're all going to sink. That's kind of how we have to approach everything.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, and good luck with the fight, and keep up the good fight is what I got to say.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
The Edifice Complex will continue in just a moment.
Are you passionate about the built environment? Do you want to learn from the industry's most inspiring, intelligent, and accomplished professionals? Then the companion to this podcast, Wisdom of the Property Crowd, is just the book for you. From Edifice Complex podcast interviews, this book distills the critical thinking, insight, and ideas of some of the property industry's most accomplished and respected practitioners. Each chapter is a synopsis of an hour-plus interview, capturing the takeaways and insights, including diagrams and images to help explain concepts and ideas. There's also a brief bio about the interviewee and a QR code linked to the podcast episode for those that want to explore further. These are the mentors you wish you had in college. Wisdom of the Property Crowd by Adam Muggleton. Available on Amazon worldwide.
And now, back to the show.
Well, how if you were to put a single word behind this episode, what would it be?
So I was sitting down while we were chatting with Amanda, thinking, what we could call this. So for me, she's an advocate, right? She's a parent advocate. So she's an advocate for clean air in schools. She's an advocate for children's health. There's so many advocate for label you could put on what she does, right? Which is pretty awesome. Because, she's covering a lot of ground there. But just the fact she stuck her head above the parapet and was willing, to take the shots.
Absolutely. That's a great visual, because when you think about all of the professionals that have been involved in the pandemic, everything from on the health sciences side all the way through to the building sciences side, and everybody in between, it was a huge scrum match. And Amanda and people like Amanda did exactly what you just said. They stuck their head above the parapet and just, the bullets were flying. And they weren't fazed by it, like they just said.
That could have gone horribly for her. She could have wound up in lawsuits. She could have been attacked by angry teachers and parents, right? It could have gone some horrible ways.
Yeah, but she didn't. And she, I'm glad I asked that question at the end about her, her ethos, like who she is and how she became that. And there's for everyone that's listening, like the students, but you got students in school, like there's a huge lesson in there. I mean, if you've been listening to the podcast since the day one, since we started 5 years ago, we always ask people to talk about their story and blah, blah, blah. And they all have great stories. And we're trying to get information into your brains about careers and making decisions and communication. And Amanda has one of those unique gifts that's incredibly valuable. If you can morph from being the number 20, number 40 sandpaper personality like you and I have to somebody that's a little bit more, can fit in and work with a larger audience and be congenial and get information and give information and build up and change things. That is a strategy, and it does work. We know from our own career past that at some point you get to a point where you just say, kid, that's it. Time out. You're done. Yeah. This is the way we're going to do it. There's no more discussion. But that doesn't always work. And it's not always a method that's appreciated, particularly when you're working with people, like in a group, where there's got to be a collaborative nature.
So here's another label. She's a connector.
She's a connector. Absolutely. Yeah.
A networker, in the real sort of like high value end of that. That networker word is thrown around a lot, right? But like she connected with people outside her sort of like pool of knowledge to advance her knowledge, to help her address a situation that was not right.
Yeah.
Now that's above the parapet and then across the parapet and then back down and back up again. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And there's a huge lesson there for, so like, don't be afraid as someone that's in school, yeah, you're naive, and yeah, you've got no life experiences, and yeah, sometimes the big world can be scary, and there'll be wolves and bears and cougars, and and people are going to bite your head off and whatever. But if you just be smart and strong and humble and willing to listen and share your own world, people's defense mechanisms tend to drop.
Correct.
Like when I think about, like, you and I, we get tons of questions from people all over the world all the time. We don't have time to answer all of them. And I try to work on a first come, first serve basis, but I must admit that those that I know are more willing to share what I share, they'll get a nod. Like I'll say, look, this person has, they're more genuine in their seeking of knowledge. This isn't just something to solve their own issue. They're trying to solve a much bigger issue that applies to a whole bunch of people. And I will give those people a little bit more leeway than somebody who's just, can you help me solve this problem I've got?
Yeah, I agree. And she's like the difference is, right, I think she was successful where maybe other people might have been, because she was not perceived as threatening. Like, you and I come in, they can see us come in, I'm angry, it's all over my face, we're going to have a fight, we're going to have an argument. And she's coming in smiling, can you just explain this to me? Can we, it's a bit like the Columbo approach, that 1970s detective. Right. Question, And that is maybe the secret to moving things along, right? Not being confrontational, not being head on like a juggernaut. Maybe that is a real lesson to take away there, actually. Don't be the confrontational asshole, which is pretty much most people. Be less direct, be open to listening and taking that other point of view. Because, she's wound up getting people like Bill to write letters, she's got involved in ASHRAE stuff, understanding ASHRAE. God, have you ever read an ASHRAE guide? We're in engineering, and they send me to sleep like page 2. So, and she's managed to get through that, synthesizing information, take it, make it useful, right? There is just so much good stuff going on there.
Yeah. One of the things and we didn't get a really chance to talk about it, but self-awareness.
Yeah.
And knowing where your weaknesses are, and knowing that that's a starting point. That doesn't define who you are. And she's, evolved into this, basically, a sponge for knowledge. But in taking that knowledge in, she also wrings it out and shares it. So for, the kids in, university, and they're trying to figure stuff out, like communication is, well, we've talked about the soft skills and particularly with engineers, but the soft skills are really important. And I think we learned in this episode just one method is.
So it's all social engineering jiu-jitsu she's pulled off there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of saying it. Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, without just being like, gloves up, let's do this. I love that. I think that's that's a stealth superpower. If more people had those soft skills, well, things would be so much better, right? There's certainly a lot less aggravation in the world. I'm pretty sure of that. But I'm really interested in what she's doing, actually. I'll keep an eye on her. She's one to watch for me, because this isn't over for her, right?
No, well, when you're an advocate, there's nothing's ever over. You're always fighting for one thing or another, and as a parent, as all parents know, you're always, I think most parents, there's an intuitive element about defending your kids. Some are much better at others. Some find it being awkward. I mean, had it not been for my late wife, who was an advocate. She was the advocates. She was just amazing to what she did in her career for people that had both mental and physical disabilities. But I saw her take that same tenacity, the tenaciousness, and apply it, in my own kids, and standing up for themselves. It's but she also said something too that, and it would actually be interesting to observe. She's not afraid to call people on their crap. And if someone's wrong and she knows they're wrong and she knows she's right, she's made it clear. She will say it. And I know she has, because I've seen her take down. Like that's what I said in the introduction, like the narcissists and the arrogant, the assholes of the world that think they know it all. And yeah, she has zero time for those people.
That's good, Matt. No, she's quite inspirational, actually. I am very impressed.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, that was a good one. I shall see you on the next one.
All right, Adam. Cheers, man.
See you later. Bye.
You've been listening to the Edifice Complex podcast with Adam Muggleton and Robert Bean. To access show notes for this episode, visit edificecomplexpodcast.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. See you next time.